The Legacy by Guy de Maupassant, who lived from 1850 to 1893, died of syphilis. This translation by Ernest Boyd from Tellers of Tales, short stories from the United States, England, France, Russia, and Germany, selected with an introduction by W. Somerset Maugham. Published by Doubleday, Duran and Company, Incorporated, New York, 1939. Chapter 1. Although it was not yet 10 o'clock, the employees were pouring in like waves through the great doorway of the Ministry of Marine, having come in haste from every corner of Paris, for the first of the year was approaching, the time for renewed zeal and for promotions. A noise of hurrying footsteps filled the vast building, which was as tortuous as a labyrinth and honeycombed with inextricable passages pierced by innumerable doors opening into the various offices. Each one entered his particular room, pressed the hands of his colleagues who had already arrived, threw off his coat, put on his office jacket, and seated himself before the table where a pile of papers awaited him. Then they went for news into the neighboring offices. They asked whether their chief had arrived, if he was in an agreeable humor, and if the day's mail was a heavy one. The clerk in charge of general matter, Monsieur César Cachelin, an old non-commissioned officer of the Marine Infantry who had become chief clerk by priority of office, registered in a big book all the documents as they were brought in by the messenger. Opposite him, the copy clerk, old Father Savant, a stupid old fellow, celebrated throughout the whole ministry for his conjugal misfortunes, copied in a slow hand a dispatch from the chief, sitting with his body held sideways and his eyes askew in the stiff attitude of a careful copyist. Monsieur Cachelin, a big man, whose short, white hair stood up like a brush on his head, talked all the time while performing his daily work. 32 dispatches from Toulon. That port gives us as much as any 4 others put together. Then he asked the old man Savant the question he put to him every morning. Well, Father Savant, how is Madame? The old man, without stopping his work, replied, You know very well, Monsieur Cachelin, the subject is a most painful one to me. Then the chief clerk laughed, as he laughed every day at hearing the same phrase. The door opened, and Monsieur Maze entered. He was a handsome, dark young fellow, dressed with an exaggerated elegance, who thought his position beneath his dignity and his person and manners above his position. He wore large rings, a heavy gold watch chain, a monocle, which he discarded while at work, and he made a frequent movement of his wrists in order to bring into view his cuffs, ornamented with great shining buttons. At the door he asked, How much work today? Monsieur Cachelin replied, It is always Toulon which keeps sending in. One can easily see that the first of the year is at hand from the way they are hustling down there. But another employee, a great joker, always in high spirits, appeared his turn and said, laughing, We are not hustling at all, are we? Then, taking out his watch, he added, 7 minutes to 10, and every man at his post? By George, what do you think of that? And I'll wager anything that His Dignity, Monsieur Le Sable, arrived at 9 o'clock, at the same hour as our illustrious chief. The chief clerk ceased writing, put his pen behind his ear, and leaning his elbow on the desk, said, Oh, there is a man for you. If he does not succeed, it will not be for want of trying. Monsieur Pithelet, sitting himself by the corner of the table and swinging his leg, replied, But he will succeed, Papa Cachelin. He will succeed, you may be sure. I will bet you 20 francs to a sou that he will be chief within 10 years. Monsieur Mauser, who rolled a cigarette while warming his calves before the fire, said, Pshaw! For my part, I would rather remain all my life on a salary of 2,400 francs than wear myself to a skeleton the way he is doing. Picholet turned on his heels and said in a bantering tone, But that does not prevent you, my dear fellow, from being here on this 20th of December at 10 o'clock. The other shrugged his shoulders with an air of indifference. Hang it all. I do not want everybody to walk over my head either. Since you come here to see the sunrise, I am going to do it, however much I may deplore your officiousness. From doing that to calling the chief dear master, as Slabz does, and staying until 6:30 and then carrying work home with you is a long way. Besides, I am in society, and I have other demands on my time. Monsieur Cachelin had ceased his registering and begun to dream, his eyes fixed on a vacancy. At last, he asked, "Do you believe that he will get an increase again this year?" Pitolet cried, "I will bet you 10 to 1 he gets it. He is not wearing himself out for nothing." And so they talked of the eternal question of promotion, which for a month had excited the whole hive of clerks from the ground floor to the roof. They calculated chances, computed figures, compared their various claims to promotion, and waxed indignant over former injustices. These discussions lasted from morning until evening, and the next day were begun all over again with the same reasons, the same arguments, the same words. A new clerk entered, a little, pale, sick-looking man, Monsieur Boisel, who lived as in a romance of Alexandre Dumas, père. Everything with him was an extraordinary adventure, and he recounted every morning to his friend Pitolet his strange encounters of the previous evening. Imaginary scenes enacted in his house, strange cries uttered in the street which caused him to open his window at 3:30 in the morning. Every day he had separated combatants, stopped runaway horses, rescued women from danger. And although of a deplorably weak constitution, he talked unceasingly, in a slow and satisfied tone, of exploits accomplished by his strong arm. As soon as he understood that they were talking of Slabz, he declared, "Someday I will give that little pup his deserts. And if he ever walks over my head, I'll give him something that will prevent him from trying again." Maza, continuing to smoke, sneered, "You would do well, then, to begin at once, for I hear on good authority that you are to be set aside this year for Slabz." Boisel raised his hand. "I swear that if—" The door opened once more, and a dapper little man wearing the side whiskers of an officer of marine or lawyer and a high, stiff collar, who spoke his words rapidly as though he could not take the time to finish what he had to say, entered quickly with a preoccupied manner. He shook hands all around with the air of a man who had no leisure for dallying, and approaching the chief clerk said, "My dear Cachelin, will you give me the Chapelot papers, rope yarn, Toulon, ATV, 1875? The clerk rose, reached for a portfolio above his head, took out a package of sealed documents wrapped in blue linen, and presenting them said, "There, Monsieur Slabz, you remember the chief took 3 dispatches from that package yesterday." "Yes, I have them. Thanks." And the young man went out, hurriedly. Hardly had he gone when Maza ejaculated, "Well, what an air! One would swear he was already chief." And Pitolet replied, "Patience, patience. He will be before any of us." Monsieur Cachelin had not resumed his writing. A fixed thought seemed to have taken possession of him. At last he said, "He has a fine future, that boy." But Maza murmured in a disdainful tone, "For those who think the ministry is a career, yes. For the others, it is a little—" Pitolet interrupted him. "Perhaps you intend to become an ambassador." The other made an impatient gesture. "It is not a question of me. I can take care of myself. That has nothing to do with the fact that the position of the head of the department will never be anything very much." Father Savant, the copyist, had never ceased his work, but for some little time he had been dipping his pen in the inkstand, then wiping it vigorously on the sponge, which stood in a little glass of water on his desk, without being able to trace a letter. The black liquid slipped along the point of the metal and fell in round spots on the paper. The good man, driven to despair as sheet after sheet of paper was thus spoiled, said in a deep and sorrowful voice,
Here is more adulterated ink.
A shout of laughter came from every mouth. Cachelin shook the table with his stomach. Mazza bent double as though he were going up the chimney backward. Pitolet stamped and roared and waved his hands in the air, and even Boiselle was almost suffocated, although he generally looked at these things on the tragic rather than the comic side. But Father Savant, wiping his pen on the tail of his overcoat, said,
There's nothing to laugh at. I have to go over my whole work 2 or 3 times.
He took from his box another sheet of paper, laid his wax sheet over it, and commenced again at the beginning.
Monsieur le Ministre and dear colleague.
The pen now held the ink and traced the letters neatly. The old man settled down into his oblique posture and continued his copy. The others had not stopped laughing. They were fairly choking. For 6 months, they had played the same game on the poor old fellow who had never detected it. It consisted in pouring several drops of oil on the damp sponge used for wiping pens. The metal, thus becoming coated with liquid grease, would not take the ink, and the perplexed copying clerk would pass hours in using boxes of pens and bottles of ink, and finally declare that the supplies of the department were becoming perfectly worthless. Then the jokers would torment the old man in other ways. They put gunpowder in his tobacco, poured drugs into his drinking water, and made him believe that since the Commune, the majority of articles for general use had been adulterated by the socialists to put the government in the wrong and bring about a revolution. He had conceived a terrible hatred for the anarchists, whom he believed to be concealed everywhere, and had a mysterious fear of an unknown woman, veiled and formidable. A sharp ring of the bell sounded in the corridor. They knew well that the emphatic ring of their chief, Monsieur Tochebouf, and each one sprang towards the door that he might regain his own compartment. Cachelin returned to his work. Then he laid down his pen again and took his head in his hands and began to think. He turned over in his mind an idea which had tormented him for some time. An old, non-commissioned officer of the Marine Infantry retired after receiving 3 wounds, 1 at Senegal and 2 at Cochin, China, who had been given a position in the ministry as an exceptional favor. He had had to endure many miseries, many hardships, and many griefs in his long career as an insignificant subordinate. He considered authority, official authority, as the finest thing in the world. The head of the department seemed to him an exceptional being, living in a higher sphere, and the employee of whom he heard it said, "He is a sharp one, he will get there yet," appeared to him of another race, another nature than himself. He had therefore for his colleague Slabz a high respect which approached veneration, and he cherished the secret desire, which was never absent from his mind, to have him marry his daughter. She would be very rich one day, very rich. This was known throughout the entire ministry, for his sister, Mademoiselle Cachelin, possessed $1 million, a clear, cool $1 million, acquired through love, they said, but purified by belated piety. This ancient spinster, who had led a gay life in her youth, had retired with 500,000 francs, which she had more than doubled in 18 years, thanks to her ferocious economy and more than frugal habits. She had lived for a long time with her brother, who was a widower with 1 daughter, Coralie, but she did not contribute in the slightest degree to the expenses of the house, guarding and accumulating her gold, and always repeating to Cachelin, "It makes no difference, since it is all for your daughter, but marry her quickly, for I want to see my little nephews around me. It is she who will give me the joy of embracing a child of our blood."